Welcome to today's episode of The Square. We are on our fourth and maybe final episode of this water series. Who knows? It's been a crazy series so far, and I'm really excited to again be joined by Samantha Flores, director of Hugo. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you for having me.
Aaron Tartakovsky, who has been extremely patient with us. He was supposed to be here for one episode, and he's on his third one. But he is the CEO and co-founder of Epic Cleantec. Aaron, thanks for so much for being here with us.
Bad beer.
And of course, Varun Kohli, joining us from New York, director of Echo. Thanks so much for getting up and being with us, Varun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
When we originally started out, we were thinking it was going to be, talking about water in terms of locations that had too much water, locations that didn't have enough water, and locations that had wild swings in their availability. And we really kind of realized we had to tackle it more from a micro to macro scale. And so we talked a little bit about water conservation and design in terms of the building and the kind of the city block scale, and then the city and the regional scale. And so today we just kind of want to tie it up with different solutions across the board. And I think we'll start with the building level. What do we need to do to have, let's, instead of just thinking about water in terms of, what it is, the percentages that we're wasting in things, what is it we would have to do? Let's think big, hairy, audacious goals. What is it that we would need to do so that we had plenty of water for anybody that needed it? It's almost like we don't want to have to think about water, but in order to do that, there has to be a focus that's greater on water than there is right now.
I mean, I think one solution would be the way that we recycle water. And I definitely think that Aaron should speak to that. That's not my level of expertise. But one other big solution I think that we need to tackle as an industry is air conditioning. We have really pushed ourselves into these arid environments that people weren't really meant to live in, and that was all due to the fact that we had figured out air conditioning. And air conditioning has always used more water and more energy than we had previously been building and designing our buildings with passive design. And so I think that we're at a scale now where we're developing different arid regions where we're pulling from the municipal water supply, we're pulling from fresh water for these air-conditioned solutions. And we need to kind of take a step back because we've also gotten to the point where we as individuals cannot live outside in the heat anymore. Our bodies aren't adapting in the same way.
We say as there's 109-degree heat.
Yeah. I mean, but even think about that. Before the invention of the air conditioner, Dallas was nowhere on the top 10 cities list.
Yeah.
I mean, Phoenix was nowhere near as big as it was today if anybody lived there before air conditioning.
Yeah.
Same with Miami. So I think it's just really important to think about it from that context because we as designers never have a second thought about our buildings not having air conditioning.
Yeah.
And I think, Varun also might be a good person to talk about the passive cooling methods that we should be deploying into our buildings. I mean, the skyscrapers that we design today would not have the same design and same solutions if we were employing natural passive ventilation.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really big opportunity, a really important area to investigate for the AEC industry, because as we use more air conditioning, we use more water, we use more energy. And the fact that we're using more energy emits more CO2 into the air, which means that it's just a continuous cycle that's increasing our inability to design our buildings more effectively and to live in these areas. So I think that that's a huge area to investigate, in addition to, recycling and using our water differently.
Totally. Aaron, what are your thoughts?
I think there are so many technological solutions, and I agree with everything that Samantha just said, but I think we need to start with a fundamental mindset shift. Because I think when it comes to the design community and the built environment, water has not traditionally been front of mind. I think we all kind of, all of us are in big cities. As much as we hear about water issues and droughts and water scarcity, ultimately when we turn on our tap, water comes out. When we flush our toilets, generally the wastewater goes away. And so we hear all of these sort of gloom and doom stories, but it's not actually affecting our daily life. And because water is relatively cheap, we aren't necessarily incentivized to be smarter use, contrasted, of course, with energy, where everyone knows you leave a room, you turn that switch off or you turn appliances off because you feel the impact in your bill. So I think, one is we need to recognize that we can't continue to build the same way, or we're going to have situations like in Phoenix, Arizona, where they had to put a moratorium on new development, or sort of all the controversy about data centers, which are extremely water thirsty, and we're putting them in deserts. All of it needs to start with just a shift, because we are going to run into situations as like Mexico City, where the jury is still out on exactly how many days they have left, but we are talking about days.
Yeah.
So, I think we need to put it front of mind, because I think right now what we see is a lot of times these water solutions get value engineered out because they're just not seen as important as energy. And if we don't start shifting that mindset, we're going to start seeing the impacts of water scarcity and wastewater capacity actually stop a lot of projects from moving forward.
Varun, on a building scale, what are some of the key things we've got to do?
I mean, there's, all the technologies that we talk about, right, that we can include for recycling or reusing. But I think there's two things that cross my mind, right? We talked a little bit about sort of human behavior in one of our previous episodes. That is super important, right? How we use, and are there things, technologies or otherwise, that we can use to impact human behavior so we're not wasting water to begin with. The other thing, as Aaron was talking about data centers, yeah, those are insane. And the way, the locations where we place them, the amount of water it takes, there should be, being the biggest data center designer firm in the world, I still think there should be some policy around, managing that water. There should be some expectation of reducing water use or recycling water use in those types of facilities. But the third thing I just wanted to highlight is one thing that has always kind of been a focus of mine, whether it comes to energy or water or other things, as designers, as architects, should we not be doing things that are more, integrated into the design process? And, there's an example of this tower that just went up recently in Manhattan, the one Vanderbilt right next to the Grand Central Station, that has a facade, that actually inundates and allows some amount of water to be collected. Now, it might not be a huge volume, but it's an expression of that technology or that idea onto the facade. So it does a couple of things. It begins to transform architecture to sort of respond to the dire need or an issue that we have to address. And I think more importantly, it becomes more visible. I've seen, when I was, I think I was doing design reviews at UPenn years ago, and I saw students coming up with ideas where not only were they collecting water, but it was running off a glass roof where it was getting cleaned somehow and then filtering it down. And the more visible it is to occupants and users, the more you begin to realize, to Aaron's point, there's things happening in this building. And that becomes really integrated as part of our design, and it's not stuff hidden behind the walls or in pipes. So I would love to see more of those kind of solutions as well.
Aaron, you mentioned right before we started recording how Epic Cleantec has found some opportunities to actually bring some of that front of house, or even like have biophilia around it, or do some things to do essentially exactly what Varun is talking about, which is to bring it not just front of house, but front of mind as people are experiencing the buildings.
Yeah, look, I think there are simple fixes, installing more efficient fixtures. I mean, we've gone from 5 gallons of flush to 1.2 gallons of flush with toilets, and those are all relatively easy fixes. But then there's sort of the more holistic, comprehensive look at buildings. I mean, buildings globally use 14% of all fresh water. Almost no buildings reuse any of their wastewater. And so the question is why? And what we have found is that, even the most sophisticated developers and owners and architects, they kind of have the same reaction to wastewater as my 7-year-old niece, which is that it's yucky, it's waste. I mean, we put waste in the name of wastewater. So there's an apprehension about, for example, doing things like on-site wastewater reuse or on-site wastewater treatment and reuse. And so what we have found is that putting this stuff front of mind and actually leading with the science, making it engaging has actually been a huge addition to a lot of our projects. And I'll give you one example. There's a lot of developers, especially these folks building multifamily, that hesitate to bring water recycling because there's this unfounded belief that it'll somehow scare people away from wanting to be in that building. So we put a system into a 40-story project in San Francisco, 550 apartments built with Related. And we were touring through this project with one of the leasing agents. Well, I should say we were with a journalist, and a leasing agent passed by, and we grabbed him. We said, hey, tell us, what do you think about the water reuse system? And they said, oh, we love it. It's actually an amazing teaching tool for us, and a recruitment tool to bring people to live in this building. And we asked them why, and they basically what it comes down to is you live in a state like California, and you are sort of inundated with news about the climate crisis, about water scarcity. There is this sense of helplessness of what can I as an individual do to fix these global problems. But then you realize that people, if they may feel helpless on sort of a macro scale, but they want to put their money to use and align with buildings and companies that align with their own values. So they will pay to live in a building that prioritizes sustainability. And this water reuse system, which was sort of previously hidden in the basement of the building, now is a showcase for this project. And now we have projects where they don't want to hide the water recycling system in the basement of the building. They want to put it in the lobby and encase it with glass and use that as an education tool for people. So there's all sorts of fun ways. I'm surrounded by plants right now that are connected to purple pipes. And purple pipes, for those who don't know, is the international symbol, the international sort of code for recycled water. Fire water is red, recycled water is purple. But there's so much we can do to just make this topic, which has previously been very literally out of sight, out of mind, sort of more front of mind.
I know we already talked about it, but some of the non-design elements of bringing that front of mind are things like you did with the beer and a few other things where you're finding fun ways to bring something like wastewater or gray water, recycled water to front of mind and showing that reuse is not only possible, it's very, very practical too.
Well, Brandon, you're wearing a NASA shirt right now.
I am.
We have astronauts who've been drinking recycled water for many decades. We have these technologies. That's not really the challenge. But what we need to help people understand is that you don't need advanced NASA technology to be able to do this. There's a lot of technologies and a lot of solutions available to all of us. It's not just reserved for astronauts.
Love that. Was that, by the way, sidebar, was that your funny story? You still have your funny story? Okay.
No,
I'll detour for a second into space. I do want to just ask, and this is a little bit out of right field, but the reason I have the NASA shirt is my sons and I went to the Houston Space Center a couple of weeks ago, and I guarantee you I was more geeked out about it than they were. But one of the things that was very front of mind, both with the space past and the space future, where we want to go, is the idea of creating colonies on both Mars and the Moon. And one of the biggest issues with that has been water, and whether or not they can find water there, whether it relates to potential for life on those planets, but also like being able to truck water across space is an extremely expensive, energy-intensive thing to do. And so if they can find some of those basic natural resources, Sam made the comment earlier, we are made of water, so it's kind of an essential thing. Are there technologies or are there things that are happening because people are looking to colonize areas that have just far less water than we can even imagine here on Earth? Are there technologies or are there ways of thinking that are translatable to the problems we have here on Earth with water?
So yeah, I can give my first answer, which is, I think a lot of people have seen the movie with Matt Damon, where he is using human excrement to actually grow food. That is not actually something that is just reserved for our extraterrestrial expeditions, but that is actually something that is done here on planet Earth. We as a company actually repurpose wastewater solids from wastewater and use that to grow plants and to fertilize plants, to add carbon back to the soil. And I think when you are in space the whole notion of waste is a lot more urgent, and how to manage waste is a lot more urgent than here on Earth, where we sort of just get it out of sight, out of mind. But I think there's a lot of different ways. There's, we can recycle urine and the nutrients in that. We can recycle the solid fraction of waste. But then, I think there's a lot of different technologies we can use to actually recycle water. There's a funny story, which is, in the early days of our company, we were going through all sorts of different startup programs and accelerators, and oftentimes they have large corporate or even government sponsors who are part of these programs because they want access to sort of the next generation technologies that are coming out of there. And so in the early days of the company, when we were very focused on sort of treating the solids, the organics and wastewater, and turning it into soil products, we were contacted by Boeing Cassis had a sort of a collaboration with the NASA space station, International Space Station. And they basically came to us and said, are there any benefits to you all from being able to test your solids processing technology, which basically think of a food processor with waste and a little chemical formulation where we're blending everything together, and it goes from a wet, smelly waste into a dry, odorless, pathogen-free product that's good for plants. They said, is there any benefit from you testing that in the zero gravity conditions of the International Space Station? So I'm not a scientist, but I went to my PhD scientists and I said, what do you guys think? Is there anything we can gain from it? They said, on a scientific level, no, there's nothing for us to gain mixing poop at the International Space Station, but it would be a great marketing story. So if you want to do it for that reason, go ahead. So I can forever say that we were then there's the other part of the story I forgot to mention, which is that I asked Boeing, I said, we are interested. Is there any opportunity for me to actually go to the International Space Station to do this? And they said it in a more polite way, but essentially their answer was, no, idiot. you are not invited to the space station.
If you don't ask, you'll never know.
That's true. But that's the story about how, so that's my story about how I got rudely rejected from traveling to the space station.
One of the things that I think is, while it's not a space age technology, it's definitely a newer technology, although not as new as some people think, and that is vertical farming. And certainly one of the big water consumption, I think it's the second largest water consumption in the States is agriculture. Mm-hmm. How is vertical farming something that can really have an effect here?
Well, I was talking about air conditioning earlier, and we are finding that in water-stressed areas that have large agricultural programs and large domesticated areas, that they're seeing this really big tension point between where does our water go? Does it go to the agriculture to support the population here? Does it go to the air conditioning to support the population here? We're in an era where deaths to heat stroke are rising and rising. So, we are seeing a tension between our agricultural processes in the way that we just naturally live. And so I think that in those areas specifically, but even more specifically just across the U.S., we need to, in my opinion, we need to start adopting vertical farming in a lot of different ways. First of all, it can, there are companies where you can take 40 acres of produce and pack it into a 1 acre facility and use 99% less water because of...
Huge number.
It's huge. They're just recirculating the water that they're feeding to the plants. And they're able to put all of the nutrients that they need to put into the plants in that recirculation. So it's an incredibly efficient process. And to me, it makes sense. It's also one of the things that they're considering when they're thinking about application on different planets or on the moon. Vertical farming would have to be a part of that. But also, one other thing I really appreciate about vertical farming is that it could be integrated extremely strategically into our urban areas to reduce food deserts, to have a bigger impact on our communities. And then also it could be a way that we could design into our buildings to enhance other green solutions or incentivize other green solutions. When we're talking about wastewater management or recycling, could we be using that for our plants? Absolutely. And that could go from a multifamily residential building into that multifamily residential building's vertical farm. And then, you could see a lot of return in that water investment.
It's hard to understand how little space vertical farming takes until you see it. We went to a restaurant in Omaha. We were there for a project, and they said something on their menu. It wasn't even a big piece of text, but it was like, all our greens and herbs and everything are produced from our vertical farms. And I'm looking around, and it's a very nice restaurant, but it's kind of dimly lit. There's no vertical farm. And so I asked the waiter, and they go, oh yeah, it's downstairs. You can just go out that door and go see it. And you walk downstairs, and underneath where everybody is sitting and eating is a big vertical farm, but it wasn't a huge restaurant. It wasn't any bigger than the restaurant, and they were providing all of their greens plus extra that went to the community. And as cool as it was to see, the kind of the mind-boggling part of that was how much was being created in such a small space.
Well, and to that point, one of the vertical farmers that we've been working with over the past few years, Eden Green, which is down the street from us, down the street meaning,
30 minutes away.
Yeah, 30 minutes away. They can do 16 to 20 turns in 1 square foot, which is the equivalent of 1 turn in traditional agricultural space. So you think about that, that's 16 to 20 times more produce a year. And not only that, they're able to not just do it seasonally as you are in the, exterior environments. They're able to do that 4 times a year, or in some cases 6 times a year. So you're able to produce so much more produce in a year. And that is encouraging when we're talking about the increase of population that our urban environments are seeing. And so thinking about moving the food closer to moving the source closer to the people who are using it, and creating a better and more efficient way of using the water, and creating a more efficient way of producing more food.
It's a win-win-win.
It sounds like it.
Varun, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was going to say, this is exactly the kind of solution and thinking we need. And I think we discussed this as well in one of our previous conversations where we were talking about systems thinking. It's the solid waste that can be used for, as nutrients to the plants. The more you have the growing closer to urban communities means lesser transportation, reduction in carbon emissions, reuse of water. You name it, it's all starts to link. And I think as designers and, solution providers, we've got to start thinking that way. And that's why I think, again, one of the things we talked about before was, we want to find solutions at the building scale, but it's got to start linking with other, with the neighborhood, with the city, with the region, so that everything starts to work in some level of synchronization and overlap. That's where we see the benefits.
One of the things, speaking of, go ahead, Aaron.
No, I just wanted to add one more layer. I think we're kind of adding all these beautiful layers to this tapestry of answers here, but I think there's one more piece, which is on education. Because I think, as Varun said, in terms of these systems and understanding how these systems work, and especially living in cities, we are very divorced from where our food is grown and how it gets to us. And I've seen this just, for example, with kids living in cities, this like magical thing happens when they actually start to understand, wow, this food came from the soil and now I'm eating it. Even with my own nieces, we have a big garden ourselves and we plant a lot of food there. And just to see the joy on the little kid's face when they plant a seed and then they can see that sprout, and then that sprout eventually grows and turns into a carrot, and then they get to eat that carrot. They start to care a lot more about it. And so I think it's just one more sort of layer of the education that is sort of an additional benefit to everything that we're talking about here.
It's funny you'd say that. My just this last week, because it's been very hot here in Texas, my 6-year-old, I woke up and I was like, God, it's really cold in the house. And again, it's like 105 degrees outside. So it's over 100 sometimes at night. And I was like, man, it's cold in this house. And then my dad alarm goes off thinking the air conditioning is definitely set too low. And we have a 2-story house. So I checked ours and it was set to, I think, 74. And we go upstairs and it is set to 50. And the current temperature was 67. And upstairs is where my boys sleep. So I go in and I knew it wasn't my 10-year-old. It had to be my 6-year-old. I wake him up because it was time for them to get for school anyway. I was like, Bryce, did you set the temperature? And he goes, yeah, Dad. And I go, did you turn it down? He goes, yeah, I was hot. And what he had done, and we have a Nest thermostat, he had just like cranked it as far as it would go and went right back to bed and didn't think about it. And so I say that as I very strongly encouraged him never to touch that thermostat again in a very dad-like way.
I was about to say, this is the most dad
relived my
story.
dad's story. But I think, you know, the thing that was interesting and I thought about later is the first thing I thought about was obviously the power cost, right? But you don't, when we can use the opportunities like this to be able to think about the water usage, there is just this relationship between water and energy. I think is interesting. It goes kind of across the board, including the conversation we had in the last episode about desalination and energy, in addition to cost being a big issue for that. The relationship between energy and water, how is that something that can be I don't even know the right word, maybe better mitigated or better understood in order for it to be something where water efficiency and recycling doesn't always have to be tied to an energy cost, or maybe it's tied to a photovoltaic cost or some other kind of renewable energy.
I mean, I think that's a big question.
Sorry.
I think all of us are probably about to say the same thing. I'll hand it over to Aaron, but one thing I will say is we use water as an energy source for a lot of things. And you know, we need to think about how we can use it more efficiently there. But we also use water as, you know, to create different pieces of equipment that can then provide energy for us. So the manufacturing of the equipment, like solar panels, the manufacturing of parts of our buildings, I mean, the way that we produce concrete uses a lot of water. So I think when we're talking about the relationship between energy and water, it's not just that they go hand in hand because they have to be used together, but it's also because there's a part that we just don't see as designers, architects, or people using different products that goes into the manufacturing process that is so intrinsically woven into how we manage our resources. And that to me is something that needs to be investigated, you know, the sooner the better. Sorry to cut you off, Aaron. You can I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I'm just excited about this topic, so I apologize for jumping in. But you know, there's a big area of focus now in our industry on the water energy nexus, because so much of our energy budget as a state here in California, or even as a country, just goes into the treatment of water, the transmission of water, and another really big one is the heating up of water. You know, we have to use energy to heat water for showers, for laundry, for cooking, for cleaning, for all sort of the industrial processes that you just talked about. You add all those up together, it's a huge percentage of our energy budget. I don't think a lot of people realize that. You know, the Department of Energy, which has historically invested about 50 times more R&D into sort of energy technologies and solutions versus water, is starting to sort of change their strategy a little bit, because they recognize sort of that water energy nexus. And you know, a few years ago, the Department of Energy dedicated $100 million to a program specifically focused on addressing solutions at the nexus of water and energy. They just renewed that earlier this year for another $75 million, because there's so much happening there. And it's addressing things like desal, it's addressing things like water heating, it's addressing things like hydropower. So it's a hugely important topic. And what's exciting is that there's so much more focus and energy and investment going into sort of tackling that very issue.
I'm curious, Varun.
I want to add just, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You want to ask the question? No, I was just going to add that, you know, there's a more fundamental energy consumption related to the amount of water used in a building, which is just pumps. Like when you look at an energy profile of any, you know, high-rise building, the pumps take up a good amount of energy, and that's directly, you know, related to the amount of water that's being used in the building. So in addition to heating the water and, you know, other energy uses, just the pumps themselves take so much of the energy.
But I'm curious how that ties in, because it ties in really well with the question I was going to ask you about green infrastructure and, you know, the kind of the realistic impact that things like green roofs and rain gardens and various elements that designers can put into a building the practical impact, it may not seem like much, but as you were saying before, when it starts to become more prevalent, the cumulative effect can really have an impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and not only that, sorry, Aaron, you want to go first?
No, please. No, go ahead.
No. Okay. I was going to say yes. And the fact that if you think about, creating something like that at a neighborhood scale, the advantages you can take from diversity, right? Like water use mostly is going to happen in the mornings when people are in their apartments, and it's going to get, reduced and used more in office spaces when people go there. So if you're able to centralize, very similar to a central utility plant for heating and cooling, it can take advantage of that diversification of buildings and really be advantageous. And there's more, I guess, more opportunities when you start to look at, neighborhood scale rather than just the building scale in terms of collecting and reusing some of that water.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, and I'm glad that Varun brought up pumping, because the movement of water is extremely energy intensive. Unlike energy, which can be stored in a battery and relatively easily moved around, water is a big, physical, heavy product. It just requires energy to move around. And, when there's been studies, for example, at UC Berkeley, where they took a city like San Francisco and they said, we will use less energy just for pumping if we have on-site water reuse in these neighborhoods. And what they did was they said, look, these wastewater facilities are generally not located in prime real estate in the middle of downtown cities. They're located away from population centers, and it costs energy to pump, the wastewater to that facility or to pump water back into the city, especially in a place like San Francisco where we have insane hills. So in many cases, we as a community, as a utility, will actually save on energy costs if we are just recycling water in a building versus having to pump it, 10, 20, 100 miles from point A to point B. So there's, again, this water energy nexus and getting smarter about how we not just design buildings, but design our cities. I think it's just a really exciting area where not a lot has been done, which just means that there's a lot to do.
So in terms of kind of putting a bow on this, there's what are the things, we talked last time about the day zero crisis in Cape Town, and you brought up Mexico City. There are, hindsight's 2020. You can look back and go, oh, well, here, and here, we could have seen that this was a possibility if we didn't change course. What are some of those key indicators that allow cities and even neighborhoods and city blocks to be able to be like, oh, hey, we definitely have a problem here. We've got to figure out a solution before we get to that crisis point?
Key indicators. Well, obviously one is when we run out of water.
Yeah, water usage.
And look, I think, we always want to prevent that from happening. But the key indicators is we just look at our water sources and our supply, and we can see very clearly. A lot of times we are drawing water from big natural bodies. Take a place like Las Vegas and Lake Mead. We can literally look on the rocks of these giant lakes and see the water levels coming down and down and down. So we can literally monitor that stuff, or even our aquifers. We can monitor the depth of how much water is there. So we generally do have some pretty sort of predictive ways to be able to see exactly what our supply looks like. That's one for sure, but I think, I think it's also needing to measure that alongside how much industry we are allowing to come to a certain place. Because I often describe our water supply as a bank, meaning we are withdrawing water and we need to deposit water back. We need to replenish our account. Many places are withdrawing faster than they can replenish. But water, we can measure it in many ways. But I think one of the ways we'll be able to do it even better is to increase the amount of smart technologies we have out there to more accurately measure water. So we know how much water is being lost in broken pipes. We know how much water we're discharging to waterways. So we are pretty smart about water now, but we can get a lot smarter in terms of how we measure it.
Varun, any thoughts?
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about is, there are some challenges around implementing water saving or recycling strategies, right? And it typically always boils down to cost and space in a city like New York. And if you think about it, unlike energy, where the systems are similar sized, but yeah, you maybe you have extra capex at the beginning of the project, but then you're benefiting or reaping the rewards by saving energy and saving your cost. That is less relevant in or less visible in water, right? Like it doesn't cost a whole lot in most cities, so you don't really see the benefit of installing a large cisterns in a building, right? It takes up space, it takes up money. That purple pipe, every time we bring it up in a new large facility, it's like, no, that's an extra, expense of just putting a new network of water lines right throughout the building. So there are those cost and space hurdles that don't seem to match up with the expense of the water itself. So I wonder, whether when we get announcements like, this year we didn't get enough rain and the reservoirs in upstate New York are lower in their capacity, should the price of water go up so that we can actually start to feel something and say, oh yeah, this is real, right? And I wonder if some of that funds can then be reutilized at a global scale and say, okay, provide funding to buildings to say, please do put in the purple lines and here's the extra funding for that. I'm sure there's some of that out there, but I think that's one of the hurdles we've seen in many projects is its space and its cost, and it usually doesn't really, there's not enough drive to put those systems in a building.
We've been talking throughout all of these episodes about implementing water reuse and recycling and green building solutions in our urban environment mostly, which is great because I remember in one of the first episodes, we talked a lot about how it's usually on the user where the conversation is today is the user is overusing or misusing water. And this may be a little bit irrelevant, but I've been thinking about that so much since we started these conversations, mainly because I have a toddler who's learning how to brush her teeth and
Don't
does
get
not.
out the thermostat
Yeah.
too long, don't worry.
Well, we're all shorties, so she probably can't reach it. But just thinking about, she's learning to brush her teeth right now. She's 2. She has no concept that the water is continuing to run, and she also gets really frustrated when it gets turned off. When she has, she doesn't have tantrums. She's too sweet for that. But whenever she has, some emotional times, we put her feet in the sink in the water and let the water run over her feet because it calms her down. We play in the backyard in the water all the time. And so I've been thinking about this water recycling because I am one person who's extremely interested in how I can reuse the wastewater in our house to be used for our irrigation systems in our backyard, for our sprinklers, those types of things. But then I think about those have the same pipes and connections for the water that I, spray her in the sprinkler and have fun, and that she likes to drink from the water hose. So, we do talk often about it is on the end user. But I love that this conversation has actually really shifted from the first episode to this episode on how it is on us as an industry to figure out how our cities can gain more benefit or even have more traction from providing these types of solutions to larger populations that are in more dense environments. And then those solutions can be adapted for those, maybe single family homes or other locations. Because I think that putting it on the end user, that's when you're going to get this challenge of maybe it's education and people don't understand how to manage it differently. It might also be the fact that we do need to manage it differently. Yeah. And maybe we haven't crossed that point yet. But I get that this may have been a little bit of a bypass, but just things to think about.
Yeah. Well, I hopefully just even the simplest form of having these conversations helps move that needle and gets people thinking about it. Sam, Aaron, Varun, thank you so much for not just today, but for the whole series and your willingness to discuss it and research it. And I'm excited about some of the follow-up episodes that I'm sure we'll have. But thank you so much for being here and contributing.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
And of course, if you want to know more about Epic Cleantec, which we're all big fans of, make sure you go and reach out to Aaron. We'll have his information in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure to check out the next Square episode.